Sarah Chen had always been invisible in the most important ways. At 24, she possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that made people forget her face minutes after meeting her. Average height, dark hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wire-rimmed glasses that seemed too big for her delicate features. She wore the same faded olive-green uniform as the rest of Alpha Squad, but somehow it looked different on her, less like battle gear and more like work clothes. The other soldiers saw her as just the tech girl, the one who fixed their radios when static crackled through during crucial missions, the one who could hack into enemy communication systems and make their encrypted messages readable, the one who stayed behind in the command tent while they went out to face real danger. They respected her skills, sure, but in the way you might respect a really good mechanic or computer programmer. Useful, necessary, but not quite one of them. Sarah never corrected their assumptions. She never mentioned the grueling months she had spent in specialized training before joining Alpha Squad. She never talked about the Black Ops missions that had been scrubbed from official records. She never explained why her personnel file had sections that were completely redacted, or why certain high-ranking officers would nod respectfully when they saw her, even though she held a relatively low rank. The truth was that Sarah Chen was a ghost long before she became Alpha Squad's technician. She had been trained by people whose names didn't appear in any military database, in facilities that officially didn't exist. She knew 17 different ways to kill someone silently, could assemble a sniper rifle blindfolded in under 3 minutes, and had a confirmed kill count that would make hardened veterans uncomfortable. But that life belonged to someone else now, or so she told herself. Alpha Squad was stationed at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, a dusty outpost in hostile territory where the line between friend and enemy shifted like sand in the wind. The base sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills that provided excellent cover for anyone wanting to watch their movements. It was the kind of place where you learned to sleep with one eye open and your weapon within arm's reach. The squad consisted of 8 members, each with their own specialty. There was Captain Martinez, their commanding officer, a career soldier with 20 years of experience etched into the lines around his eyes. Sergeant Thompson served as their demolitions expert, a cheerful giant of a man who treated explosives with the same care others might show to newborn babies. Corporal Jackson was their medic, steady-handed and calm under pressure. The twins, Rodriguez and Rodriguez, no one bothered with first names, handled heavy weapons and had an almost supernatural ability to predict each other's movements. Then there was Private Wilson, barely 19 and still writing letters home to his girlfriend every night. Specialist Hayes, their communications expert, who worked closely with Sarah on technical matters. And finally, there was Sarah herself, officially listed as Technical Support Specialist, unofficially known as the person who could make any piece of technology work properly, even when it had been shot, dropped, or exposed to enough sand to bury a small village. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Sarah was in her usual spot in the command tent, surrounded by banks of monitors and communication equipment. She had been tracking enemy movement patterns for the past week, noting how their patrol routes had been shifting gradually northward. It was subtle, the kind of change that might look random to a casual observer, but Sarah's trained eye recognized it as preparation for something bigger. She had tried to bring her concerns to Captain Martinez twice in the past 3 days, but each time she had been dismissed with a polite nod and a reminder that intelligence gathering was handled by specialists back at headquarters. Sarah bit her tongue and returned to her screens, knowing that headquarters was looking at satellite imagery and intercepted communications, but missing the small details that could only be seen from ground level. The other squad members went about their routines with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had been working together for months. They cleaned weapons, reviewed mission parameters, and engaged in the kind of casual banter that helped pass time between operations. To them, Sarah was just part of the scenery, always present but never quite, participating in their world of shared danger and brotherhood forged in combat. What they didn't know was that Sarah spent her free time maintaining skills they couldn't imagine she possessed. Late at night, when the rest of the squad was asleep, she would slip out of the base and move through the surrounding terrain like a shadow. She would practice shooting at targets she set up in hidden locations, using weapons she had quietly acquired through channels that didn't appear in any requisition forms. She told herself it was just habit, muscle memory that refused to fade. She told herself that she was done with that life, that she had chosen to be Sarah the technician instead of the other person she used to be. But deep down, she knew that some things never really leave you. The training was too thorough, the instincts too deeply ingrained. As the sun climbed higher that fateful morning, Sarah noticed an unusual pattern in the radio chatter she was monitoring. Enemy units were maintaining radio silence in sectors where they usually reported in regularly. It was another small detail, easy to miss unless you had been listening to their communications long enough to know what normal sounded like. She cross-referenced this information with the movement patterns she had been tracking and felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. The enemy wasn't just shifting their patrol routes randomly. They were repositioning for an attack on the base, and based on the timing and coordination she was seeing, it would happen soon. Sarah looked around the command tent at her squad mates, going about their business with no idea what was coming. Captain Martinez was reviewing supply requests. Sergeant Thompson was teaching Private Wilson how to properly set a charge. The others were scattered around the base, performing routine maintenance and duties. For a moment, Sarah considered one more attempt to raise the alarm through official channels. But she knew how it would go. She would be thanked for her diligence and told that proper procedures required confirmation from multiple sources before any alert could be issued. By the time those confirmations came through, if they ever did, it would be too late. Instead, Sarah quietly began making her own preparations. She checked the equipment she would need, ran through mental rehearsals of procedures she hadn't used in months, and prepared herself for the possibility that the person she used to be might need to surface one more time. The attack came at dawn just as Sarah had predicted. She was awake, having spent the night in restless preparation when the first mortar round exploded near the eastern perimeter. The blast shook the command tent and sent equipment tumbling from tables, but Sarah was already moving, her body responding to training that had been drilled into her until it became instinct. Chaos erupted across forward operating base Kestrel. Alarms blared as more explosions rocked the compound. Enemy forces had positioned themselves in the surrounding hills under cover of darkness, using the terrain Sarah had warned about to devastating effect. They had mortars, heavy machine guns, and what sounded like at least 50 fighters based on the volume of gunfire now raining down on the base. Captain Martinez's voice crackled over the radio, trying to coordinate a defense while rounds pinged off the concrete barriers around his position. "All units, defensive positions. Hayes, get me communication with headquarters. Chen, I need a status report on our equipment." But Sarah was no longer thinking like a technician. The moment the first explosion hit, something fundamental had shifted inside her. The careful barriers she had built around her old self crumbled like paper walls. She could hear the distinctive whine of incoming mortar rounds, could calculate their trajectory and impact points based on sound alone. She knew exactly how the enemy had positioned themselves for maximum effectiveness, and more importantly, she knew their weaknesses. The squad members scrambled for defensive positions, but they were caught completely off guard. Private Wilson was pinned down behind a supply truck, return fire keeping him from reaching better cover. The Rodriguez twins had made it to the heavy weapons position, but enemy snipers were making it impossible for them to operate effectively. Sergeant Thompson was trying to reach the armory, but sustained fire had turned the open ground between buildings into a killing field. Sarah watched her squad mates struggle against an enemy that had every advantage. The attackers had chosen their timing perfectly, hitting during the shift change when half the base personnel were still waking up. They had positioned themselves in the hills during the night, probably using routes Sarah could have predicted if anyone had listened to her analysis of terrain vulnerabilities. Most devastating of all, the enemy had clearly studied the base's defensive capabilities and positioned their forces to neutralize Alpha Squad's heaviest weapons first. This wasn't a random raid or crime of opportunity. This was a carefully planned assault designed to eliminate everyone on the base. For a few crucial minutes, Sarah remained in character. She grabbed her radio equipment and tried to establish communication with headquarters, calling for backup and air support. But the enemy had thought of that too. Jamming equipment was blocking most frequencies, and the few channels that remained open were filled with static and fragmented transmissions that made meaningful communication impossible. It was when she saw Private Wilson take a hit that something inside Sarah finally snapped. The young soldier cried out as a bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind inadequate cover. Enemy fighters were advancing on his position, and Wilson was too wounded and disoriented to defend himself effectively. Sarah looked at the radio in her hands, then at the chaos around her, and made a decision that would change everything. She set down the equipment and moved to a weapons locker that officially she wasn't supposed to know the combination to. Her fingers worked the lock without hesitation, muscle memory guiding her to weapons that most technicians would never have been trained to use. She selected a modified rifle with a scope, extra ammunition, and several other items that would have raised questions if anyone had been watching. But everyone was too busy fighting for their lives to notice the squad's quiet technician transform into something entirely different. Sarah's first target was an enemy sniper positioned on a rocky outcrop, about 400 meters away. He had been systematically picking off anyone who tried to move between buildings, keeping the squad trapped in isolated positions. Through her scope, Sarah could see him adjusting his position to get a better angle on Wilson's location. The shot was perfect. One moment the sniper was there, the next he was gone. The other squad members probably assumed it was random luck or friendly fire from an unseen friendly position. They had no reason to suspect that their mild-mannered technician had just made a shot that required skills few people in the military possessed. But Sarah was just getting started. Years of suppressed training and instinct were flooding back, and she began to see the battlefield with a clarity that had been dormant for months. She could read the enemy's tactics, predict their movements, and identify vulnerabilities in their assault that her squad mates couldn't see. Moving like smoke between positions, Sarah began systematically eliminating threats. She took out the mortar team that had been raining death on the base, silencing their weapons with precise shots that the enemy couldn't trace back to their source. She eliminated machine gun nests that had been pinning down the Rodriguez twins, allowing them to finally bring their heavy weapons to bear. The transformation was complete, but invisible. To her squad mates, it might have looked like the tide of battle was turning due to their own efforts and random chance. Enemy positions that had seemed impregnable suddenly went silent. Threats that had been keeping them pinned down mysteriously disappeared. They were too focused on surviving to notice the ghost moving through their midst, death following in her wake. Sarah felt the familiar calm that came with this kind of work. Time seemed to slow down, allowing her to process information and make calculations with superhuman clarity. She could hear the distinct sounds of different weapons, track multiple targets simultaneously, and plan attack routes that would keep her invisible to both enemy and friendly forces. What made her truly dangerous wasn't just her marksmanship or tactical knowledge. It was her ability to think like the enemy, to understand their psychology and use it against them. She knew that confusion was spreading through their ranks as their carefully planned assault began to fall apart for no apparent reason. She knew that doubt and fear were more effective weapons than bullets when used correctly. As she eliminated target after target, Sarah began to implement a larger strategy. She wasn't just killing enemies. She was orchestrating their psychological destruction. She left some targets alive deliberately, knowing they would spread panic when they reported impossible shots coming from empty positions. She created the illusion of a much larger defensive force by attacking from multiple directions in quick succession. The enemy had expected to face 8 soldiers defending a poorly positioned base. Instead, they found themselves fighting phantoms. The battle had been raging for 30 minutes when Captain Martinez began to notice something strange. Enemy positions that had seemed secure were falling silent one by one, but he couldn't identify what was causing it. His radio crackled with confused reports from his squad members, each describing how threats that had been pinning them down were mysteriously disappearing. Rodriguez 1. Report status on that machine gun nest, Martinez called into his radio. Sir, it just stopped firing. No movement from that position for the last 5 minutes, came the puzzled reply. Martinez frowned as he scanned the battlefield through his binoculars. The enemy assault had been perfectly coordinated at first, showing the kind of professional planning that made his stomach clench with worry. But now their attack was falling apart, and he couldn't understand why. It was as if an invisible force was systematically dismantling their offensive capabilities. What Martinez couldn't see was Sarah Chen moving through the chaos like a predator born for this environment. She had positioned herself in the shadows between buildings, using blind spots and terrain features that she had mapped out during her late-night reconnaissance missions. Every movement was calculated to keep her invisible to both friend and foe. Her next target was a forward observation post that had been directing mortar fire onto the base. 3 enemy fighters had positioned themselves behind rocks about 300 meters away, using radio equipment to coordinate attacks on Alpha Squad's defensive positions. They felt safe because they were well hidden, and far enough away to avoid direct engagement with the base's defenders. Sarah approached from an angle they would never expect, moving through a drainage ditch that ran parallel to their position. She had noticed this terrain feature weeks ago during one of her unauthorized night patrols, filing it away as potentially useful information. Now that knowledge was proving its worth, the first fighter never knew what hit him. Sarah's knife found the gap between his body armor and helmet with surgical precision, dropping him silently while his companions remained focused on their radio equipment. The second fighter turned just in time to see Sarah's face for a split second before her pistol spoke once, the suppressed shot barely audible over the ongoing battle. The third fighter had enough time to realize what was happening, but not enough time to react. Sarah moved with fluid efficiency, eliminating him before he could raise an alarm or reach for his weapon. Within seconds, the observation post that had been causing so much trouble for Alpha Squad was neutralized, but Sarah didn't stop there. She gathered intelligence from the dead fighters, checking their radio frequencies and tactical maps. What she discovered made her blood run cold. This wasn't just an assault on forward operating base Kestrel. It was part of a larger coordinated attack involving multiple enemy units. Alpha Squad was facing only one prong of a 3-pronged offensive designed to eliminate all friendly forces in this sector. The enemy had planned this operation for weeks, possibly months. They had detailed intelligence about the base's defenses, shift schedules, and personnel assignments. Someone had been feeding them information, or they had been conducting surveillance far more sophisticated than anyone at headquarters had realized. Most concerning of all was what Sarah found in the tactical commander's equipment. According to their operational plans, 2 additional enemy companies were moving to support this assault. If those reinforcements arrived before Alpha Squad could break the current attack, the base would be completely overrun. Even with Sarah's intervention, 8 soldiers couldn't hold against that kind of overwhelming force. Sarah made a strategic decision that went far beyond her official role as squad technician. She began hunting not just to defend her squad mates, but to break the enemy's will to fight entirely. She needed to create enough chaos and fear to force them to retreat before their reinforcements could arrive. Moving to a new position, Sarah identified the enemy's command structure. Combat experience had taught her to recognize the signs of battlefield leadership, the subtle differences between regular fighters and those making tactical decisions. She could see them by how others positioned themselves relative to their location, by the radio equipment they carried, and by the way they moved with authority, rather than simply following orders. Taking out enemy leaders would create confusion and disrupt their coordination, but it required a different approach. These targets would be better protected and more alert to danger. Sarah would need to take greater risks to reach them, but the payoff would be worth it. Her first command target was positioned behind a cluster of boulders that provided excellent cover from the base's defensive positions. He was using a radio to coordinate between different assault teams, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to command. Sarah could hear fragments of his transmissions as she approached, and what she heard confirmed her worst fears about enemy reinforcements. The approach required Sarah to cross open ground that was partially visible from multiple enemy positions. Under normal circumstances, it would have been suicide. But Sarah wasn't moving under normal circumstances. She used smoke from burning equipment to mask her movement, timing her advances with the sound of gunfire and explosions that would cover any noise she might make. When she was within range, Sarah didn't take the easy shot. Instead, she waited and observed, learning about the enemy's command structure and communication protocols. She identified 2 additional leaders before finally acting, then eliminated all 3 in rapid succession using different weapons and attack angles. The effect was immediate and devastating. Without clear leadership, the coordinated enemy assault began to fragment into isolated firefights. Different units started operating independently, making tactical mistakes that Alpha Squad could exploit. Confusion spread through enemy ranks as subordinate leaders tried to assume command without understanding the overall battle plan. Sarah could hear the change in enemy radio traffic, the shift from confident coordination to worried questions and contradictory orders. Some units began requesting permission to withdraw to defensible positions. Others called for reinforcements that were still hours away. The psychological tide of battle was turning, but the physical threat remained enormous. That's when Sarah noticed movement in the hills that made her realize just how desperate their situation had become. Through her scope, she could see the advance elements of enemy reinforcements beginning to arrive. If she didn't act quickly, Alpha Squad would face overwhelming odds regardless of how much damage she had already inflicted. It was time to stop being invisible and start being something far more dangerous. Sarah began implementing tactics that would leave no doubt about her presence on the battlefield. Techniques designed to create maximum psychological impact on enemy forces. She was no longer hunting individual targets. She was declaring war on their entire operational capability. Sarah's transformation into something far more lethal became evident when she decided that subtlety was no longer sufficient. The enemy reinforcements were moving closer, and she needed to create chaos on a scale that would force a complete retreat. What happened next would become the stuff of legend among military circles. Though the official reports would never capture the full truth, she began with psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale completely. Sarah had noticed that the attacking force included many young fighters who were probably experiencing their first serious combat. These soldiers would be more susceptible to fear tactics than seasoned veterans, and fear could spread through an army faster than any weapon. Moving to a position overlooking the main enemy assault route, Sarah began what could only be described as a demonstration. She didn't just eliminate targets, she made examples of them. Enemy fighters who had thought themselves safely hidden behind cover suddenly found their protection meaningless against an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Sarah used advanced marksmanship techniques that most soldiers only heard about in training stories. She made impossible shots through narrow gaps in cover, eliminated targets at ranges that shouldn't have been feasible with standard equipment, and demonstrated an understanding of ballistics that bordered on supernatural. Each kill was precisely calculated not just for tactical effect, but for psychological impact on anyone who witnessed it. The enemy had positioned sniper teams in the surrounding hills, thinking their elevated positions would give them safety and clear fields of fire. Sarah systematically hunted them down, turning their advantage into a liability. She moved through terrain that should have been impossible to traverse undetected, appearing behind positions that the enemy thought were secure. One particularly devastating sequence began when Sarah identified a cluster of enemy fighters who had taken cover in a natural depression between two hills. They believed they were invisible from the base and had been using their position to coordinate flanking attacks on Alpha Squad's defensive positions. Sarah approached from above, using a climbing route that required skills most soldiers didn't possess. From her elevated position, she could see the entire enemy formation spread out below her. Instead of picking them off individually, Sarah implemented a tactic that would create maximum confusion. She eliminated the fighters at the edges of the formation first, working her way inward in a pattern that would make survivors feel increasingly trapped and isolated. The psychological effect was devastating. As their comrades fell around them, the remaining enemy fighters began to panic. They started firing wildly at shadows, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions to Sarah's methodical advance. Some tried to flee, only to discover that their escape routes had been quietly blocked. Others attempted to call for help, but found their radio communications jammed by equipment Sarah had captured from eliminated command posts. What made this sequence particularly terrifying for the enemy was that they never actually saw their attacker. Sarah remained invisible throughout the entire engagement, a phantom presence that seemed to strike from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The fighters who survived long enough would later describe the experience as being hunted by a ghost, never knowing where the next shot would come from or which of them would be next. Meanwhile, Alpha Squad was beginning to realize that something extraordinary was happening. Captain Martinez noticed that enemy pressure on their positions was decreasing rapidly, but not in a way that suggested a coordinated withdrawal. Instead, it seemed like the attacking force was being systematically destroyed by an unknown third party. "Hayes, are you getting any radio traffic about friendly forces in the area?" Martinez asked over the communication system. "Negative, sir. No reports of any other units operating in this sector," Hayes replied, his voice puzzled. "But I'm picking up a lot of confused chatter from enemy frequencies. Sounds like they're taking heavy casualties from an unknown source. Sergeant Thompson had managed to reach a position where he could observe some of the surrounding terrain through binoculars. What he saw didn't make sense according to conventional military thinking. Enemy positions that had been actively engaging them were now silent. But he couldn't identify what had neutralized them. "Captain, I'm seeing abandoned equipment and positions all over the hillside," Thompson reported. "Looks like whatever hit them left no survivors. But I can't figure out what kind of weapon could have done this kind of damage without us hearing sustained gunfire." The answer was moving through the battlefield like a force of nature. Sarah had entered a state that her old trainers used to call operational flow, where training, instinct, and battlefield awareness combined into something that transcended normal human limitations. She wasn't thinking about individual tactics anymore. She was orchestrating the complete destruction of enemy combat effectiveness. Her next target was the most ambitious yet. Enemy reinforcements had established a temporary command post in a fortified position about a kilometer from the base. This wasn't just a tactical target. It was the nerve center coordinating the entire multi-pronged assault. Eliminating it would not only protect Alpha Squad, but potentially save other friendly units that were facing similar attacks in adjacent sectors. The approach required Sarah to cross terrain that was actively patrolled by enemy forces. Under normal circumstances, it would have required a full squad and heavy support to even attempt such a mission. But Sarah wasn't operating under normal circumstances. She moved through enemy-controlled territory like smoke, using techniques that combined military training with something that seemed almost supernatural. She eliminated patrol teams that never knew they had been compromised. She bypassed security checkpoints using routes that shouldn't have existed. She gathered intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions that would have taken conventional reconnaissance teams days to acquire, all while maintaining complete invisibility to both enemy forces and her own squad mates back at the base. When Sarah finally reached the enemy command post, she discovered something that changed the entire nature of her mission. The assault on Forward Operating Base Kestrel wasn't just part of a larger offensive. It was a test run for a massive attack planned against the main Allied base in the region. The enemy had chosen Alpha Squad's isolated outpost as a proving ground for tactics they intended to use against a target that housed over 1,000 personnel. The intelligence Sarah gathered from the command post revealed that the enemy had been planning this operation for months, possibly with inside help from someone with access to classified information about Allied defensive capabilities. They had detailed maps of not just Forward Operating Base Kestrel, but of every friendly installation in the region. Most disturbing of all, Sarah discovered that the attack on Alpha Squad was being observed and analyzed by enemy commanders who were already planning the larger assault. They were studying how Allied forces responded to overwhelming odds, learning from each engagement to refine their tactics for the main offensive. Sarah realized that her mission had evolved beyond simply protecting her squad mates. She was now in a position to prevent a catastrophic attack that could cost hundreds or thousands of lives. But doing so would require her to abandon any pretense of being just a technician and embrace the full extent of her lethal capabilities. Sarah stood in the enemy command post, surrounded by intelligence that could prevent a massacre, and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She couldn't just gather this information and hope to transmit it back to headquarters through compromised communication channels. She needed to ensure that the enemy's larger offensive capability was completely destroyed, and that meant escalating her actions to a level that would leave no doubt about what had happened here. The command post contained detailed operational plans, communication codes, and most importantly, the locations of enemy staging areas where forces were assembling for the main assault. Sarah photographed everything with equipment she carried, but she also began implementing a plan that would eliminate these threats permanently. Using the enemy's own communication equipment, Sarah began feeding false information into their command structure. She reported successful completion of objectives that hadn't been achieved, confirmed the destruction of Allied capabilities that were actually intact, and most devastatingly, she began redirecting enemy units into positions where they would be vulnerable to the kind of systematic elimination she had been conducting all morning. But Sarah's most audacious move was yet to come. She used the command post's secure communication system to contact the enemy reinforcements that were still approaching Forward Operating Base Kestrel, speaking in perfect mimicry of the command post's communication protocols. She began issuing orders that would fragment and isolate these forces. "Command to Assault Group 2, Sarah transmitted, her voice carrying the calm authority of a senior enemy officer. "Abort approach to primary objective. Intelligence indicates Allied reinforcements are moving to intercept. Fall back to secondary positions and await further orders." The response crackled back immediately. "Assault Group 2 confirms. Falling back to defensive positions. Request updated intelligence on Allied force strength." Sarah smiled grimly as she continued her deception. "Allied forces estimated at company strength with air support en route. All units are to avoid direct engagement until strategic situation can be reassessed. Command will provide updated operational parameters within 2 hours." This single transmission accomplished more than hours of direct combat could have achieved. Enemy reinforcements that had been moving to overwhelm Alpha Squad were now retreating to defensive positions, buying precious time for actual Allied reinforcements to arrive. More importantly, Sarah had created confusion in enemy ranks that would take hours to resolve. But she wasn't finished. Using intelligence gathered from the command post, Sarah began implementing what could only be described as a systematic campaign of terror against enemy forces. She had identified the locations of ammunition depots, fuel storage areas, and communication relay stations that supported the entire enemy operation in this region. Moving like a force of nature through enemy-controlled territory, Sarah began destroying the infrastructure that made the larger offensive possible. She used explosives taken from eliminated enemy positions to create chain reactions that destroyed supply depots. She sabotaged communication equipment in ways that would cause cascading failures throughout their network. She eliminated key personnel, whose specialized knowledge was crucial to maintaining enemy operational capability. Each action was calculated not just for immediate tactical effect, but for long-term strategic impact. Sarah wasn't just defending forward operating base Kestrel anymore. She was single-handedly dismantling an enemy capability that had taken months to build and position. The explosions began 30 minutes after Sarah left the command post. A series of massive blasts echoed across the valley as ammunition depots detonated in spectacular fashion. The sound carried for miles, alerting both friend and foe that something extraordinary was happening in this sector. Back at forward operating base Kestrel, Alpha Squad watched in amazement as enemy positions throughout the surrounding hills erupted in flames. Captain Martinez tried to reach headquarters to determine if they were receiving unexpected support, but communication systems were still partially jammed. "Sir, I'm seeing secondary explosions all across the valley," Sergeant Thompson reported. "Looks like someone is hitting enemy supply lines and staging areas. This is way beyond anything we could have accomplished from our position." Private Wilson, despite his wounded shoulder, had managed to reach a vantage point where he could observe the systematic destruction of enemy capabilities. "Captain, whoever is doing this knows exactly where to hit them. It's like they have complete intelligence on enemy positions and vulnerabilities." What Wilson and the others couldn't see was Sarah moving through the chaos she had created, continuing to eliminate targets of opportunity, while the enemy struggled to understand what was happening to their carefully planned operation. She moved from one objective to the next with methodical precision, each action building on the last to create a cascade of destruction that the enemy couldn't stop or even fully comprehend. Sarah's most challenging target was a heavily fortified position where enemy commanders had gathered to coordinate their response to the unexpected attacks on their infrastructure. These weren't just tactical leaders. They were the strategic minds behind the entire regional offensive. Eliminating them would cripple enemy capabilities for months. The position was protected by multiple layers of security, with clear fields of fire in all directions and overlapping coverage from heavy weapons. Under normal circumstances, it would have required a coordinated assault by multiple units with air support to have any chance of success. But Sarah had advantages that conventional forces lacked. She had been observing enemy tactics and procedures all morning, learning their patterns and identifying their weaknesses. She knew how they positioned sentries, how they responded to threats, and most importantly, how they thought about battlefield security. This knowledge allowed her to approach their most secure position using methods they would never anticipate. The assault began with psychological warfare designed to create confusion and fear among the defenders. Sarah eliminated outer perimeter guards using methods that left no evidence of how they had died. creating the impression that they were facing supernatural forces. She used sound and movement to suggest attacks from multiple directions, forcing defenders to spread their attention and resources. When Sarah finally penetrated the fortified position, she moved with such speed and precision that the enemy commanders never had time to coordinate a response. She eliminated them systematically, gathering final intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions before ensuring that their command structure was completely destroyed. The intelligence Sarah gathered in those final moments revealed the true scope of what she had accomplished. The enemy offensive that had threatened not just Alpha Squad but the entire Allied presence in the region was now in complete collapse. Supply lines were destroyed, communication networks were in chaos, and key personnel were eliminated. What had been a coordinated military operation was now a confused collection of isolated units with no clear leadership or objectives. As Sarah prepared to return to Forward Operating Base Kestrel, she realized that her actions had solved one problem while creating another. Alpha Squad would survive and the larger enemy offensive would fail, but she had revealed capabilities that would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The invisible technician who had served quietly for months was about to become the center of attention in ways that could expose secrets she had worked hard to bury. The return journey to Forward Operating Base Kestrel gave Sarah time to process what she had done and prepare for the questions that would inevitably follow. She had eliminated 53 enemy fighters, destroyed multiple command structures, and single-handedly prevented a regional offensive that could have cost hundreds of Allied lives. But in doing so, she had also revealed skills that no ordinary technician should possess. As she approached the base perimeter, Sarah could see her squad mates moving with the careful efficiency of soldiers conducting post-battle procedures. The immediate threat was over, but they were still alert for possible counterattacks or hidden enemies. What they wouldn't expect was for their missing technician to emerge from the very territory where the enemy had been eliminated, so, systematically, Sarah paused at the edge of the base to observe her squad mates and gauge their current state of mind. Captain Martinez was directing a perimeter sweep while trying to establish communication with headquarters. The Rodriguez twins were checking equipment and counting ammunition. Sergeant Thompson was treating Private Wilson's shoulder wound with supplies from the medical kit. They all looked confused and shaken, not just by the intensity of the battle they had survived, but by the inexplicable turn of events that had saved their lives. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations as they tried to make sense of what had happened. "I'm telling you, there's no way conventional forces could have done this," Sergeant Thompson was saying as he worked on Wilson's bandages. The precision, the timing, the complete destruction of enemy capabilities. This was something else entirely. Specialist Hayes looked up from the communication equipment he was trying to repair. Maybe it was special operations. You know, the kind of unit that doesn't officially exist. They could have been in the area and responded when they detected the attack. Captain Martinez shook his head. Special Ops would have identified themselves or at least coordinated with us. This felt more like, I don't know, like we had a guardian angel who decided to take out every enemy in a 50-mile radius. Sarah smiled grimly at the irony of that statement. In a sense, they weren't wrong. She had been their guardian angel, though not the kind they were imagining. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made her final preparations before rejoining her squad. She checked her appearance to ensure there was no obvious evidence of the morning's activities. Her uniform was dirty and torn in places, but that could be explained by taking cover during the attack. She had minor cuts and bruises that were consistent with someone who had been moving through debris and damaged structures. Most importantly, Sarah prepared her story. She would say that she had been trapped in a collapsed section of the command tent when the attack began, and had spent the morning trying to dig herself out while staying hidden from enemy forces. It wasn't a perfect cover story, but it would explain her absence and her disheveled appearance without raising immediate suspicions. "Alpha Squad, this is Chen," Sarah called out as she approached the perimeter, making her voice sound weak and shaken. "I'm coming in from the eastern sector. Don't shoot." The response was immediate and relieved. Captain Martinez's voice crackled over the radio with genuine concern. "Chen, where the hell have you been? We've been trying to reach you for hours." "Equipment malfunction trapped me in the command tent when it partially collapsed," Sarah replied, maintaining her cover story as she walked into view. "I've been trying to dig my way out and avoid enemy patrols. What's the status of the base?" Sergeant Thompson was the first to reach her, his face showing relief mixed with amazement. "Sarah, you picked one hell of a time to get trapped. You missed the most incredible thing I've ever seen in 20 years of military service." As her squad mates gathered around, Sarah listened to their excited accounts of the morning's events. They described the systematic destruction of enemy forces, the mysterious explosions that had eliminated enemy supply lines, and the complete collapse of what had initially seemed like an overwhelming assault. "It was like watching a masterclass in asymmetric warfare," Captain Martinez explained. "Someone with incredible skills and perfect intelligence about enemy positions just dismantled their entire operation piece by piece. I've never seen anything like it." Private Wilson, despite his wounded shoulder, was practically bouncing with excitement. "Sarah, you should have seen it. Enemy positions were getting taken out left and right, but we never saw who was doing it. It was like having an invisible army on our side." Sarah nodded and made appropriate sounds of amazement while internally processing how her squad mates had experienced the battle. Their perspective was exactly what she had hoped for. Complete confusion about the source of their salvation, but no suspicion that it might have come from within their own ranks. "Any word from headquarters about who might have been operating in our sector?" Sarah asked, playing her role perfectly. Hayes shook his head. "That's the strange part. No reports of any friendly forces in the area. No special operations units, no air support. According to official channels, we were completely on our own out here." "Maybe it was enemy forces fighting among themselves," Sarah suggested, providing an alternative explanation that might satisfy official investigators. "Internal conflicts, competing objectives, that sort of thing." Captain Martinez looked thoughtful. "That's possible, but the precision was too surgical. This looked more like someone with perfect intelligence and specialized training, the kind of skills you don't see outside of very specific military communities." As the conversation continued, Sarah began to realize that her cover story might not hold up under detailed investigation. Her squad mates were intelligent, experienced soldiers who would eventually start asking uncomfortable questions about how their technician had survived hours of intense combat without any means of communication or self-defense. More concerning was the fact that headquarters would certainly send investigators to determine what had happened at Forward Operating Base Kestrel. The scale of enemy casualties and the precision of their elimination would attract attention from intelligence agencies that might have the resources to uncover the truth about Sarah's background. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted her thoughts. 2 military transport aircraft were visible on the horizon, growing larger as they approached the base. Sarah felt her stomach clench as she realized that the cavalry was finally arriving, along with investigators who would want detailed accounts of everything that had happened. "Looks like the brass is finally showing up," Sergeant Thompson observed. "They're going to want a full debrief on what happened here." Captain Martinez began organizing his squad for the formal inquiry that would inevitably follow. "Everyone needs to prepare detailed reports on their actions during the attack. Command is going to want to understand how we survived an assault that should have overrun us completely." As the helicopters landed and disgorged passengers in dress uniforms mixed with combat gear, Sarah recognized the insignia of military intelligence personnel. These weren't just rescue forces. They were investigators sent to determine how a small, isolated base had survived what appeared to be a coordinated assault by superior forces. Among the arriving personnel, Sarah noticed someone who made her blood run cold. Colonel Janet Morrison was a legendary figure in certain military circles, known for her ability to uncover secrets that others preferred to keep buried. She specialized in investigating unusual combat outcomes and had a reputation for finding explanations that others missed. Morrison's presence meant that headquarters was taking this incident very seriously. They wanted answers about what had happened at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, and they had sent someone who was uniquely qualified to find them. As Colonel Morrison approached Alpha Squad, her eyes swept over each member with the kind of professional assessment that missed nothing. When her gaze reached Sarah, there was a moment of recognition that sent chills down Sarah's spine. Morrison knew something about Sarah's background, something that could unravel the carefully constructed identity she had built as the squad's harmless technician. "Alpha Squad," Morrison announced in a voice that carried absolute authority, "I need to conduct individual interviews with each of you regarding this morning's events. We're particularly interested in understanding how enemy forces were neutralized so effectively despite your Unit's limited defensive capabilities, Sarah realized that her greatest challenge was just beginning. She had survived the battle and protected her squadmates. But now she faced an opponent who might be even more dangerous than the enemy forces she had eliminated. Colonel Morrison represented the possibility that Sarah's past would finally catch up with her, exposing secrets that could destroy not just her carefully constructed new life, but potentially put her squadmates in danger as well. Colonel Morrison conducted her interviews with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. She spoke with each member of Alpha Squad individually, comparing their accounts and looking for inconsistencies that might reveal what had really happened during the attack on Forward Operating Base Kestrel. Sarah was called last, a strategic decision that allowed Morrison to gather information from the other squad members before confronting the person she suspected might hold the key to solving this puzzle. When Sarah entered the makeshift interview room that had been set up in one of the base's administrative buildings, she found Morrison studying a tablet filled with preliminary reports and battlefield analysis. Technical support specialist Sarah Chen, Morrison began, her voice carrying a tone that suggested she knew more than she was revealing. According to your squadmates, you were trapped in the command tent for most of the battle. That must have been a terrifying experience. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, maintaining the nervous demeanor that would be expected from a technician who had just survived her first major combat situation. The explosions brought down part of the structure. I was pinned under equipment and debris for several hours. Morrison nodded thoughtfully, making notes on her tablet. It's interesting that you managed to survive in the command tent, considering that it was one of the first targets hit by enemy mortars. The structural damage suggests that anyone inside should have been seriously injured or killed. Sarah felt the first stirring of real concern. Morrison wasn't just conducting a routine debriefing. She was actively investigating inconsistencies in the official story. I was fortunate to be in a section that remained partially intact. The equipment that fell on me actually provided protection from subsequent explosions. I see, Morrison replied, her tone suggesting polite skepticism. And during those hours when you were trapped, you had no communication with your squadmates and no ability to observe the battle that was raging around you. That's correct, ma'am. My radio was damaged, and I couldn't see anything except debris and damaged equipment. Morrison set down her tablet and looked directly at Sarah, with eyes that seemed to see through every carefully constructed layer of deception. Specialist Chen, I'm going to share something with you that might change the nature of our conversation. Preliminary analysis of the battlefield suggests that enemy forces were eliminated by someone with extremely advanced training in asymmetric warfare, sniper tactics, and psychological operations. Sarah kept her expression neutral while her mind raced through possible responses. That's fascinating, ma'am. Do we know who might have been operating in the area? That's what makes this situation so intriguing, Morrison continued. There were no friendly forces reported in this sector. No special operations units, no air support. According to every official record, Alpha Squad was completely isolated when the attack began. The colonel stood and walked to a map of the surrounding terrain that had been mounted on the wall. Red marks indicated locations where enemy casualties had been found, creating a pattern that told its own story to anyone who knew how to read it. The elimination pattern suggests a single operator working alone, Morrison explained, tracing the progression of attacks with her finger. Someone who understood enemy tactics well enough to predict their movements, who possessed marksmanship skills that border on the supernatural, and who had access to detailed intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said could potentially incriminate her further. Morrison was clearly building toward something, and the best strategy was to let her reveal her hand before committing to any specific response. The most interesting aspect of this case, Morrison continued, is that we found evidence of techniques that are only taught in very specific training programs. Programs that officially don't exist, conducted by instructors whose names don't appear in any personnel database. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that Morrison wasn't just fishing for information. She had specific knowledge about Sarah's background and was testing to see how Sarah would respond to increasingly direct pressure. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, Sarah said, playing for time while she evaluated her options. Morrison returned to her seat and opened a file that Sarah hadn't noticed before. Specialist Chen, I'm going to ask you a direct question and I want you to consider your answer very carefully. Have you ever received training in advanced combat techniques beyond what would be standard for a technical support specialist? The moment of truth had arrived. Sarah could continue her deception and hope that Morrison didn't have enough evidence to prove anything, or she could trust that the colonel's investigation was motivated by a desire to understand what had happened, rather than to prosecute anyone for unauthorized actions. Colonel Morrison, Sarah began slowly, I think there are some aspects of my background that might not be fully reflected in my current personnel file. Morrison leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone whose theory had just been confirmed. I thought there might be. Would you care to elaborate on those aspects? Sarah made a decision that would change everything about her military career and her relationship with Alpha Squad. Before joining this unit, I received specialized training that prepared me for operations that require unconventional approaches to problem solving. And during this morning's attack, you decided that the situation required an unconventional approach. I assessed that Alpha Squad faced overwhelming odds and that conventional defensive tactics would result in total casualties, Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength as she abandoned her technician persona. I made a tactical decision to engage enemy forces using capabilities that were available, but not officially part of my current assignment. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me since I arrived at this base. Now, would you mind providing me with a more detailed account of your actions this morning? For the next hour, Sarah described her activities during the battle with the precision and detail that Morrison's investigation required. She explained her analysis of enemy tactics, her strategic decisions about target prioritization, and her assessment of the larger threat that the assault represented. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly focusing on understanding the full scope of what Sarah had accomplished. When the account was complete, the colonel sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes before speaking. Specialist Chen, what you've described represents one of the most effective single-operator defensive actions in modern military history. You prevented not just the loss of Alpha Squad, but potentially saved hundreds of lives by disrupting the larger enemy offensive. Sarah waited for the other shoe to drop, expecting accusations of exceeding authority or operating outside of established protocols. Instead, Morrison surprised her. The question now is what we do with this information. Your actions were clearly justified by the circumstances, but they've also revealed capabilities that certain people in the military hierarchy would prefer to keep secret. Ma'am, I understand that my background might create complications. I'm prepared to accept responsibility for any violations of protocol or unauthorized disclosure of classified capabilities. Morrison smiled for the first time since the interview began. Specialist Chen, you're not in trouble. Quite the opposite. Your actions this morning have attracted attention from people who are very interested in individuals with your particular skill set. The question is whether you're interested in returning to the kind of work you were trained for, or if you prefer to continue your current assignment with Alpha Squad. Sarah considered the implications of Morrison's offer. Returning to her old life would mean leaving behind the squad mates who had become something like family, but it would also mean using her skills for missions that could prevent tragedies like the one that had almost occurred at Forward Operating Base Kestrel. Colonel, if I may ask, what would happen to Alpha Squad? Would they be told about my background? That depends on what you decide, Morrison replied. If you choose to return to specialized operations, your current identity would be maintained and Alpha Squad would receive a new technical support specialist. They would never know that their technician had been responsible for saving their lives. And if I choose to stay with Alpha Squad? Morrison's expression became more serious. Then certain aspects of your background would need to be disclosed to Captain Martinez and possibly to your squad mates, depending on security clearance issues. Your role within the unit would necessarily change. Sarah realized that she was facing a choice that would define the rest of her military career. She could return to the shadows and continue the work she had been trained for, or she could stay with the people who had become her family and find a way to integrate her specialized skills into a more conventional military structure. Looking out the window of the interview room, Sarah could see her squad mates working to repair battle damage and restore the base to operational status. They were laughing and joking despite the morning's trauma, displaying the resilience that made them such an effective team. The thought of leaving them felt like abandoning family. "Colonel Morrison," Sarah said finally, "I'd like to stay with Alpha Squad. These people have become important to me, and I think my skills could be valuable in protecting them and others like them." Morrison nodded approvingly. "I hoped you would say that. Welcome back to the war, Specialist Chen. Though I suspect your squad mates are going to have some very interesting questions when they learn who their technician really is." As Sarah left the interview room, she knew that her life as the invisible technician was over. But perhaps being visible wasn't such a bad thing after all, especially when it meant protecting the people who mattered most to her. The ghost was ready to step into the light.